Hello everybody, this video is all about resisting persuasion or making people more persuadable. So let's start with resisting persuasion. What are a couple ways we can resist persuasion? Well, one way is simply by warning people that they're about to be persuaded. And when this happens, it tends to violate people's sense of freedom, and it creates a reactance effect. So people tend to rebuff any efforts that any efforts you may exert at changing their attitude, because again, them knowing that you're trying to change their attitude makes them feel less free, and so to reassert their feelings of freedom, they react. They basically close their ears and close their eyes and just blah, 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 blah. They reject the persuasion attempt. So one way to resist persuasion: be warned that persuasion is about to happen. There are some situations in life where persuasion is more likely. There are others where it's less likely. So be aware of when persuasion is more likely, and you're probably more likely to resist it. The second way that I want to talk about is through something called attitude inoculation. So you've probably heard the word inoculation before. It's a vaccine is an inoculation. The way inoculations often work is that you experience a weakened version of that thing that you're being inoculated against. So let's say with vaccines, you're given a weakened or a dead version of a particular virus, and your body builds up some way to fight that virus, and so when or disease, and so when it encounters that disease at its full strength, it already has mechanisms for fighting that disease off. Well, attitude inoculation is basically the same. So the idea is that you're given weakened, simplistic versions of some attitude that you don't have. That way, when somebody tries to persuade you to change your attitude over to match theirs, you already have these small counter arguments that you've built up as the basis for the way that you can basically counter argue their persuasive message. So they're going to give you a persuasive message. Well, if you've been inoculated, you already have some counter attitudes ready to debate them with, and more than likely they're going to having those attitudes, or those counter arguments, are going to make it less likely for them to successfully persuade you to change your attitude. All right, so there's a couple ways that you can resist persuasion. Now, what are some ways to increase persuasion? One, put them in a good mood. People typically aren't as resistant to persuasion when they're in a good mood. Even when they think more and in a good mood, they often tend to think positively. They often tend to think positive things about the persuasive message. So get people in a good mood, and they're more likely to be persuaded. And two, there's some work suggesting that an attitude is kind of thought of as a part of the self. And so anytime a person tries to change your attitude, you view it as an attack on the self. And because of that, you tend to be very resistant. But according to self-affirmation theory, because the self is kind of a global structure, you can kind of bolster the general self, and it makes a person less resistant to a specific attack on the self. So a persuasion attempt. So if you bolster the self, you validate some other component of the self, it makes them less resistant to a persuasion attempt, because the self is validated, and so an attack on some small component of their self isn't as threatening. That, my friends, is it for this video on resisting persuasion and trying to get people to be more easily persuaded. And as usual, if you have any questions, please send them my way. But that is it for this video.